Emily Hart pressed both hands flat against the splintered post of the trading post rail and told herself she was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. She had survived worse than this. She had survived Arthur Vance. She could survive a dusty mountain town that wanted nothing to do with her. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and watched the last wagon she'd arrived on disappear around the canyon bend, taking with it every plan she'd made for the next 3 months of her life. She was 26 years old. She had $11, and every person on this street had already decided she wasn't worth the trouble. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The trading post at Harrow's Notch sat at the base of the Caldwell mountain range like something the land had coughed up and forgotten about. 3 buildings, a livery, a water trough that was down to a finger's width of brown water, and a stretch of packed dirt road that shimmered in the August heat, like the earth itself was angry about something. Emily Hart had been standing on that road for going on 2 hours. She'd counted the minutes by the way the sun moved across the canyon wall opposite a trick her father had taught her when she was small, back when her father was still the kind of man who taught her things. She'd stopped counting at the hour mark because counting made her feel the full weight of what was happening to her, and she couldn't afford that right now. She couldn't afford to feel anything that wasn't useful. The driver of the supply wagon, a thick-necked man named Paul, who smelled like pine tar and old tobacco, had told her at the 1 hour mark that he wasn't going any further up the mountain road. "Contract says Harrow's Notch," he'd said, not looking at her. "This is Harrow's Notch. The contract says Millbrook Station." Emily had replied, and she'd kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even. She'd had years of practice. "Millbrook Station is another 14 miles up the ridge. Road ain't safe past the Notch in summer. Dry slides. You want to argue about it? Argue with the company office back in Delacorte. Delacorte is 3 days behind us." "Yes, ma'am." He'd said it with a kind of flat finality that made it clear he didn't consider that his problem. "There's a water trough over there. You could ask somebody inside if they're heading up." Then he'd climbed back onto his wagon and turned it around, and she'd watched him go. And she had not cried. She'd gone inside. She'd asked somebody. She'd asked for somebody's. The woman behind the trading post counter had looked at her the way people look at something that might cause them difficulty, and said she didn't know anything about mountain transport. The 2 men playing cards in the corner had looked at her in a way she recognized the measuring, appraising look that made her skin tighten, and one of them had said they might be able to help her with a smile that made it clear helping her was the last thing on their minds. She'd thanked him without accepting and walked back outside. That was 2 hours ago. She was starting to understand that no one in Harrow's Notch was going to help her. Not because they couldn't, because they'd already decided who she was. The word had moved fast. It always moved fast in small places. Woman traveling alone. No husband. No name anyone recognized. Asking about Millbrook Station, which was deep in Caldwell land, which meant she had no business being there, unless she was somebody's business, and she didn't look like she was anybody's anything right now. She had a worn cotton dress, a single travel bag boots that had cracked along the left sole, somewhere around the second day on the road, and $11 folded into the inside lining of her sleeve. She had a letter of introduction to a woman named Mrs. Clara Ames at Millbrook Station, who ran a boarding situation for working women, and who had advertised in the Delacorte Courier for a ledger keeper and supply manager. She had a mind that was sharp, and a handwriting that was clean, and a capacity for hard work that had never once failed her. None of that mattered here. Here she was just a problem nobody wanted. She put her back against the post rail and watched the road and tried to think. The sun was past the center of the sky, which meant she had maybe 5 hours before dark. The canyon got cold fast once the sun dropped below the western ridge. She'd been warned about that by a woman at the last way station. A kind older woman who'd pressed a piece of dried jerky into her hand and told her the mountains didn't care who you were or what you deserved, so you'd better be prepared for them. She had one blanket in her travel bag, and no shelter, and no way to get either before nightfall, unless something changed. She could walk. 14 miles was not nothing, but she wasn't fragile. She'd walked further in worse circumstances. But the mountain road past the notch was narrow, and she didn't know it. And if the driver had been telling the truth about dry slides, if he'd been telling the truth about anything which she wasn't entirely willing to grant, then walking it alone in the late afternoon was not a reasonable choice. She could go back inside and try again. She could offer money. She had $11 and no income until she reached Millbrook Station. But $11 was $11, and people in a place like this understood $11. She was still running the arithmetic in her head when she heard the sound of horses coming in from the north road. Not one horse. Several. The kind of steady, unhurried pace that meant someone who knew where they were going and wasn't in a hurry to explain themselves to anyone. She didn't look up right away. She'd learned not to look up too fast. Looking up fast told people things about you, that you were anxious, that you were waiting on something, that you were hoping. She waited until she heard the horses slow, and then she turned her head with the careful casualness of someone who happened to be looking in that direction. There were 3 riders. 2 of them were younger, trail dusty, and loose in the saddle the way young men get when they've been riding all day and are thinking about supper. The third was something different. He rode a dark bay horse wide through the chest, the kind of horse that cost more than most men made in a season. The man on it sat straight without being rigid. The way someone sits when riding is so natural, it doesn't require thought anymore. He was lean, sun-dark, somewhere in the middle 30s by the lines around his eyes. He wore a plain canvas work shirt, no decoration, a hat pulled low against the glare, and he was scanning the area around the trading post with the automatic alertness of someone who'd learned a long time ago that not paying attention cost you. His eyes landed on her. Not the way the card player's eyes had landed on her. This was different. This was the way a man looks when he's assessing a situation, quick, thorough, and without much personal involvement. He took in her cracked boots and her travel bag, and the way she was standing against that post like she was deciding whether to let it hold her up, and then he looked away. He swung down from the bay without any apparent hurry, handed the reins to one of the younger riders, and walked into the trading post. Emily watched him go. She told herself it was nothing. Men rode through trading posts. They didn't stop to help women they didn't know standing in the heat. That wasn't how the world worked, and she was old enough, she had been made old enough to know better than to expect it. She looked back at the road. She heard the trading post door open again. She didn't look up. "You're the one asking about Millbrook Station?" It wasn't a question. The voice was flat and low and didn't carry any particular warmth, but it didn't carry contempt either, which put it ahead of most of what she'd heard today. She looked up. He was standing maybe 6 feet from her, hat still on, and he was looking at her with the same assessing directness he'd used from the saddle. Up close, she could see the scar on his left forearm, where it showed below his rolled sleeve, old burn or rope, she couldn't tell which. His eyes were dark brown and gave away about as much as creek water. "I am," she said. "Do you know a way to get there?" "I'm going there," he said. "Got room on the supply wagon if you can keep up without complaint?" Emily looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. "I don't complain," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, maybe. "We leave in 20 minutes, he said. "If you're not on the wagon, we leave without you." He turned and walked back toward the livery. "I didn't catch your name," she called after him, because if she was going to climb into a wagon with a stranger on a mountain road, she was at least going to know his name. He didn't turn around. "Caldwell," he said. "James Caldwell." She pulled in a breath. Caldwell. As in Caldwell. Land. Caldwell Territory. Caldwell Mountain Range, stretching 60-odd miles up the ridge. As in the name that the men in the trading post had used when they were explaining why the road past the notch wasn't safe for outsiders. She picked up her travel bag. She had 20 minutes. She made it in 18. The supply wagon was loaded flat and heavy boxes and barrels and coils of rope that smelled like linseed oil. There was a bench seat up front where the driver sat a young man who introduced himself as Pete without being asked, and who had the kind of open, uncomplicated face that suggested he'd never in his life deliberately made things difficult for anyone. She liked him immediately. James Caldwell rode ahead on the bay horse. He didn't look back. Pete seemed to think this was normal. "Mr. Caldwell always rides point," he offered, after they'd been going about 10 minutes, and Emily was sitting very straight on the bench and trying not to let the jostling of the wagon on the rocky road knock her sideways. "He don't like surprises on this section of the road. Says surprises on a mountain road are just mistakes you didn't see coming." "That's a philosophy," Emily said. Pete grinned. "He's got a lot of those. Don't say them often, but when he does, they tend to stick." He navigated the wagon around a deep rut with practiced ease. "You going to be working at Millbrook then?" "I hope to be," she said. "I have a letter for Mrs. Ames." Pete nodded like that answered something. "Good woman, Mrs. Ames. She don't suffer fools, but she treats people fair. You'll do all right if you work straight." "I work straight," Emily said. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said in the way someone says it when they actually believe you. "I can usually tell." The canyon road wound upward in long switchbacking curves that made the wagon groan on every turn. The heat was still fierce, but the air was moving now, carrying the dry smell of pine resin and baked rock, and something else underneath it, wild sage maybe, or something she didn't have a name for. It was a hard smell, an honest smell. She found she didn't mind it. They were about 40 minutes out of Harrow's Notch when James Caldwell dropped back from the point position and brought the bay alongside the wagon. "Road gets rough for the next half mile," he said to Pete rather than her. "Keep the left wheels out of the drainage cut. Last dry storm took some of the road edge out." "Yes, sir," Pete said. Caldwell's eyes moved to her for just a moment. "You holding all right?" It surprised her. Not the question, but the directness of it. No softening, no performance of politeness, just a plain inquiry. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and moved back to the front. She thought about that one nod for the next 10 minutes. It had communicated something, that nod. She just wasn't sure yet what. What happened at the third switchback was fast and loud and gave her no time to do anything useful. She heard a sound like the mountain clearing its throat, a deep grinding rumble from somewhere up and to the left of the road. Pete said something sharp under his breath and hauled on the reins, and the wagon lurched to a stop just as a section of dry shale came down the slope about 30 yards ahead, filling the left side of the road with a loose tumble of rock and pale dust. It wasn't large, it wasn't catastrophic, but it was completely blocking the way forward. Emily sat very still on the bench and breathed slowly and told her heart to settle down. James Caldwell was already off his horse. He'd moved so fast she hadn't seen it one moment he was ahead of them. On the road the next, he was on foot, standing at the edge of the slide and reading it the way she'd seen her father read ledgers, methodically, looking for the structure of it. The other rider, a quieter young man named Cord, who hadn't said 10 words since Harrow's Notch, came up beside him. "Bad?" Cord asked. "Manageable," Caldwell said. "Lose the big slab on the left and we've got enough clearance." He looked at Cord. "Get the pry bar." What followed was about 20 minutes of methodical, silent work. Caldwell and Cord moved rock with a practiced efficiency that spoke of men who dealt with this kind of problem regularly. Pete stayed on the wagon. Emily climbed down. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She just climbed down, picked up a flat piece of shale that was on the near edge of the slide, and moved it off the road. Caldwell looked over at her. She picked up another piece. He looked back at the work. She wasn't sure, but she thought she heard something that might have been a breath of a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite approval, but something in that territory. They cleared it in 20 minutes instead of 30. When the road was open again, Emily climbed back onto the wagon bench, brushed the pale dust off her hands, and straightened her dress. She was thirsty. Her left boot sole was flexing in a way that suggested the crack was getting worse. Her hair had come half out of its braid in the effort, and she had no doubt she looked like something that had been put through a hard day. She didn't care. She was still moving forward. Caldwell came to the side of the wagon. He held out his canteen without saying anything. She took it, drank, handed it back. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Not accusatory, just stating a thing. "I know," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. That dark, direct, giving nothing away gaze. Then he said, "3 more hours to Millbrook." "All right," she said. He went back to his horse. 3 hours turned into 4 when the second problem arrived. His name was Deacon Harp, and he came riding down the North Spur Road at a pace that said he was either looking for something or outrunning something, and the 3 men behind him suggested the former. He pulled up directly in front of the supply wagon, forcing Pete to haul the horses to a stop, and he sat his horse with the particular arrogance of someone who had never in his life needed to ask anyone for anything, because he'd always found it easier to simply take. He was maybe 40 heavy through the shoulders with a face that had been made mean by long practice. He had a star on his chest, the kind that looked more like a claim than a credential. "Caldwell," he said, looking past Emily like she wasn't there. "Heard you picked up a stray at the notch." Caldwell had already turned the bay around. He moved up alongside the wagon without rushing, and he stopped between Harp and the wagon with a positioning that was not quite blocking, but had the same effect. "I brought on a worker," he said. "Word out of Delacourt is different." Harp's eyes finally moved to Emily, and she recognized the look instantly. She'd been catalogued. "Says she's contracted property. Somebody paid off a debt in her name. She ain't free to take work." The silence that followed was very loud. Emily had known this was possible. She had been hoping it wouldn't reach her this fast, but she had known it was possible. Arthur Vance had resources. Arthur Vance had friends in places that made things difficult for women who left arrangements they'd been told they had no right to leave. She opened her mouth. "She works at Millbrook," Caldwell said. He said it the way he said everything flat, absolute finished. Like it was a sentence that had already been closed, and he was only reading it aloud as a courtesy. "You got a problem with that, you come to the ranch and bring paperwork." "I got 4 men," Harp said. "I can count," Caldwell said. Harp stared at him. Caldwell looked back. And what was remarkable about that moment, what Emily would think about later when she had time to think about anything, was that Caldwell didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who has already decided what he'll do and is simply waiting to see if he has to do it. Harp pulled his horse aside. He wasn't backing down. Men like Harp didn't back down, they postponed. But he pulled aside, and the 4 men behind him pulled aside, and Pete clicked the horses forward, and the wagon rolled past. Emily looked straight ahead. She did not look at Harp. She did not let him see her hands, which had gone very still in her lap, in the practiced, deliberate stillness of a woman who had spent years making herself look smaller than she felt. She was not going to give him a single thing to take back to Arthur Vance. They rode in silence for a while. Pete didn't say anything, which surprised her a little, because Pete seemed like someone who filled silence naturally. Then she looked at him and saw that he wasn't not talking because he didn't have anything to say. He was not talking because he was giving her the space to be whatever she needed to be right now. She liked him even more for that. After a while, she said, "He'll come back." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. "He will. Does that happen often? Men with badges making claims on—" She stopped, recalibrated. Making claims on workers headed to Millbrook. Pete was quiet for a moment. "There's been some trouble with the Territory Land Office. People trying to use legal paper to run workers off range they don't want settled. Mr. Caldwell's been dealing with it for about a year now." He paused again. "He don't let go of what's his." Emily looked at that word. His. She'd been claimed as his before, and it had not been a thing she wanted to be again. Then she looked ahead at James Caldwell on the bay horse riding the point position, scanning the road with that same methodical attention. He hadn't looked back once since the confrontation with Harp. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't managing her. He had simply stated a fact: she works at Millbrook, and moved on. He means work, she said. Not quite a question. Yes, ma'am, Pete said with quiet certainty. That's all he ever means. The last hour of the ride was quieter. The heat softened as they climbed higher, and the canyon walls opened up into long graded slopes where Emily could see the shapes of cattle moving in the distance, small dark forms against pale grass. The sky was enormous up here. She hadn't expected that. She'd been thinking about the practicalities of the trip for so long, she'd forgotten to notice that the world she was riding through was genuinely, almost violently beautiful. Millbrook Station was a cluster of buildings at the head of a wide bowl-shaped valley. Functional, solid, nothing that wasn't working for its own keep. James Caldwell pulled up as they came through the gate and swung off his horse. He handed the bay off to Cord and walked toward the wagon as Pete was setting the brake. "Mrs. Ames will see you," he said. "She's expecting a ledger keeper." "I know," Emily said. "I'm the one she's expecting." Again, that not-quite movement at the corner of his mouth. He reached up and she climbed down, not because she needed the assist, but because refusing it would have been making a point for the sake of making one, and she was too tired for that. Her boots hit the packed dirt of Millbrook Station. She was here. She'd made it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He paused. "Thank you," she said, "for the transport, and for—" she paused. "For the other thing." He looked at her for a moment. That long, flat, giving nothing away look that she was beginning to understand was not coldness so much as economy. He didn't spend words he didn't have to spend. He didn't spend looks either. But this one held a beat longer than it needed to. "Harp's paper won't hold," he said. "What he said about contracts, it won't hold. Not on my range." She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her she was safe. Not warm, not kind, not personal, just factual. Safe. Here. On this ground. "All right," she said. He nodded once and walked away. Emily Hart stood in the yard of Millbrook Station with her cracked boot and her travel bag and her $11 and the letter she'd carried 3 days across hard country, and she looked at the buildings around her, the long barn, the supply house, the main structure with smoke already rising from the kitchen chimney, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief. Relief was too simple for what it was. It was something closer to the feeling of ground under your feet after too long at sea. Not comfort. Not joy. Just solidity. The particular solidity of a place that asks you to work for your place in it, and means it, and will give you exactly what you earn, and nothing that you haven't. She had not had that in a very long time. The kitchen door opened and a stout woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and eyes the color of winter sky looked out and said, "You the Hart woman?" "Yes, ma'am," Emily said. "You eat yet?" "No, ma'am." "Well, come in then," Mrs. Clara Ames said. "We'll sort out the rest after supper." Emily picked up her travel bag and walked toward the door. Behind her across the yard, she heard the bay horse shifting its feet and the low, unhurried sound of James Caldwell giving instructions to his men, practical, direct, not a word wasted. She didn't look back. But she noted, without quite meaning to, that his voice carried the same quality as this ground. The same quality as those mountains, unmoved by things that had no business moving it, present in a way that didn't announce itself. She filed that away. She didn't know yet what to do with it. She walked inside. Supper at Millbrook Station was not a gentle affair. Mrs. Ames ran her kitchen the way Emily imagined she ran everything, with the kind of efficient authority that didn't require volume. There were 6 people at the long table. Emily, Mrs. Ames, Pete Cord, a heavy-set older man named Duff, who managed the water troughs and said nothing beyond passing the bread, and a sharp-eyed woman named Lila, who did the mending and supply inventory, and looked Emily over with the careful attention of someone deciding whether a new piece of furniture was going to cause problems. Emily ate everything on her plate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite hit her, and then she had to practice considerable restraint not to eat like someone who hadn't had a real meal in 3 days, which was exactly what she was. James Caldwell did not eat with them. She noticed his absence without meaning to. She'd half expected him to be at the head of that table. It was his ranch, his land, his name on every fence post and boundary marker for 40 miles. But his chair, the one at the far end that had a quality of space around it, the others didn't sat empty. "He eats in the study when there's paperwork," Lila said without looking up from her food, as if Emily had asked aloud. "I wasn't—" Emily started. "You were looking at the chair," Lila said. "Everybody looks at the chair first time." Mrs. Ames made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Lila, manners!" "I'm just saying," Lila said unbothered. Emily looked at her plate. She filed that away too, the way information moved in a place like this, fast and sideways, the way it did in any small closed community, where everyone knew everyone else's patterns by simple proximity. She was going to have to get used to being read quickly. She was going to have to get used to being new. After supper, Mrs. Ames took her through the supply ledgers. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the books spread open between them. And within about 4 minutes, Emily understood that whoever had been keeping these records before her had been adequate, but not careful. Numbers that should have reconciled didn't. Supply entries were logged by date, but not by category, which meant tracking actual usage required reading every entry in sequence rather than by type. 3 months of feed costs were recorded in a shorthand that apparently only made sense to the person who'd invented it. "Who kept these before?" Emily asked. "Man named Garrett," Mrs. Ames said. "He left in the spring." "Left or left?" Mrs. Ames said in a tone that closed the subject. Emily looked at the books. "I'll need about 2 weeks to restructure the logging system. After that, it'll run clean." Mrs. Ames looked at her for a moment, that winter sky assessment again. "Garrett said the same thing when he started. Took him 3 months and it still didn't run clean." "I'm not Garrett," Emily said. The silence that followed could have gone either way. Then Mrs. Ames said, "No, I don't reckon you are." She closed the top ledger. "Lamp goes out at 9. You're up at 5. Your room is the second door on the left up the stairs." "Yes, ma'am." "And Miss Hart." Mrs. Ames paused with her hand on the lamp. "Whatever you came from, and I don't need to know what it was, it stays outside that gate. You work straight, you'll be treated straight. That's all this place runs on." "That's all I'm asking for," Emily said. Mrs. Ames took the lamp. Emily sat in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening to the sounds of Millbrook settling into night, the shift of horses in the distant barn, the low wind moving over the valley, something creaking in the main structure that had probably been creaking for 20 years. She was here. She was safe. She had work. She told herself that was everything. She almost believed it. She was up before 5. Old habit. She'd learned early that the first person up in any household controlled the first hour of the day, and the first hour shaped everything after it. She had the kitchen fire going and water on before Mrs. Ames came downstairs, and she watched the older woman take that in without comment, and felt something like approval pass between them without either of them naming it. She spent the first morning in the supply house, taking inventory by hand, writing every item in her own notation system in a small book she'd brought from Delacorte, precisely for this purpose. She was on her 3rd page when she heard boots on the supply house steps, and looked up to find James Caldwell in the doorway. He looked at the book in her hand, then at the shelves she'd already been through, which she'd reorganized by category as she went. "Mrs. Ames said you'd be in the ledgers," he said. "I'm doing a physical count first," Emily said. "The written records don't match what's actually here. I need to know which one's wrong before I can fix either." He stepped inside, looked at the shelf nearest him, rope tools, spare harness hardware, and then back at her. "How far off?" "Feed costs are overstated by about 12% over the last quarter, best I can tell. Could be theft, could be logging error, could be someone miscounted and never caught it." She paused. "I'll know more by end of week." Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, nothing about him was dramatic, but there was a quality of attention that sharpened. "Garrett said the feed account was running fine. Garrett's numbers don't reconcile, Emily said. She said it straight without apology because it was a fact, and facts didn't need softening. I'm not saying he was dishonest. I'm saying the records are wrong, and someone needs to know that. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the supply house door behind him, and she could see the tiredness around his eyes. The deep structural kind that said he'd been working problems she didn't know about before she'd even gotten here. All right, he said. Let me know what you find. He turned to go. Mr. Caldwell. He stopped. She hadn't planned to say anything else. But the thing with Hart was sitting at the back of her mind where it had been since yesterday, and she was not the kind of person who let things sit there indefinitely without addressing them. Hart, she said. What's his actual reach? The badge, is it territorial or county? Caldwell turned back. County. Why? Because county authority doesn't extend to private range without the landowner's consent under the territorial code. If he comes back with paperwork, he needs a territorial endorsement for it to be valid on your property. The quiet that followed was different from his other quiet moments. This one had a texture to it. Where'd you learn territorial code? He said. My father was a merchant, Emily said. He dealt with land contracts for 30 years. I kept his books from the time I was 14. She held his gaze. I'm good with numbers, Mr. Caldwell. And I know when something doesn't add up, ledgers or legal paper. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, Harp's got a man in the county land office. He's been using him to generate paper on workers and small holders he wants off the range. Fraudulent filings, Emily said. Can't prove it yet. You can if the filing dates don't match the territorial record dates, she said. County filings have to be registered at the territorial office within 30 days. If the territorial records don't show the filing within that window, the county paper is void. She paused. Do you have access to the territorial records? Caldwell stared at her. It was the longest he'd looked directly at her without looking away, and she felt the weight of it, not uncomfortable, just significant the way it feels when someone is genuinely recalibrating what they think they know. There's a territorial land office in Creston, he said slowly. 3 days' ride. Send someone who knows what they're looking for, Emily said. Or tell me what names and dates to check and I can write the inquiry. I know the form. Another silence. Then, I'll think on it. He left. Emily turned back to her shelves. Her hand, she noticed, was very steady. She was good at steady. She had been good at steady for a long time. But her heart was doing something a little faster than usual, and she was fairly certain it was not entirely about the territorial land records. Dad. The first week at Millbrook moved the way hard work always moved, fast during the day, slow at night, when the body was tired, but the mind wasn't quite done yet. Emily restructured the ledger system in 6 days instead of 14. She found 4 separate discrepancies in the feed and supply accounts, 3 of which were logging errors, and 1 of which was something else. Something that made her sit very still for a long moment before she wrote it down. $40. Drawn against the supply account in 3 separate entries over 2 months, each one small enough to not stand out on its own, each one logged under a category that was legitimate. Garrett's shorthand she'd learned to read by that point, and once she could read it, she could see what he'd been doing. She sat with that for a day. Then she went to Mrs. Ames. I need to speak with Mr. Caldwell, she said. Mrs. Ames looked up from the mending she was doing. Read Emily's face. I'll send cord. James Caldwell came to the supply house that evening after the day's work was done. Emily had the ledger open on the work table with the relevant entries marked. She showed him without preamble. Walked him through the 3 entries. Showed him how the shorthand obscured the individual amounts, but the total was clear once you added across categories. He didn't say anything for a long time. Garrett left in April, he said finally. The last entry is March, Emily said. So either he stopped or someone else continued in his style, and I can't tell the difference yet. She paused. I don't think someone else continued. The shorthand's too consistent. It's the same hand all the way through. I think he stopped because he knew I was coming or someone like me. How? The advertisement for a ledger keeper ran in February, Emily said. The entries stop in March. Caldwell's jaw tightened. It was the most visible emotion she'd seen from him. You're saying he knew we were looking for someone to audit the books? I'm saying the timing is notable, Emily said. What you do with that is your decision. He looked at the ledger for another long moment. Then he looked at her. This is the second time in a week you've handed me a problem I didn't know I had. That's what you hired me for, she said. I hired you to keep books. You hired me to keep them right, she corrected. That's not the same thing. Something in his face did that thing again, that not quite movement, the almost acknowledgement. She was getting better at reading it. She thought it might be the closest he came to being impressed. Write up what you found, he said. Everything. Dates, amounts, the notation breakdown. I'll need it documented. Already done, she said, and handed him a folded paper from beside the ledger. He took it, opened it, read it. She could tell by the way his eyes moved that he was reading it carefully, not skimming. You wrote this before you came to Mrs. Ames, he said. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. He folded the paper, put it in his shirt pocket. How sure are you? Sure enough to put my name on it, Emily said, which I did, bottom of the last page. He was quiet. Outside, she could hear Pete crossing the yard saying something to Cord about the north fence. Normal sounds, working sounds, the sounds of a place that ran on people doing what they said they would do. Miss Hart, Caldwell said. Yes. You've been here a week. 6 days, she said. In 6 days you found a theft, a legal vulnerability in Harp's filing scheme, and 3 accounting errors that have been sitting in those books for months. He paused. Where were you before Delacourt? She hadn't been expecting the question. She'd been expecting him to say something about the work, about next steps, about what he needed from her going forward. Not that. Various places, she said. Before various places. She looked at him. He looked back, and she understood that he was not asking out of nosiness or possession, or the particular territorial interest that some men took in women who seemed to be more than they'd accounted for. He was asking because he was a man who needed to know what he was working with. The same way he'd assessed her from the road in Harrow's Notch. Practical. Direct. No performance. I was married, she said. The arrangement went badly. I left. The contract Harp mentioned. It wasn't a legitimate contract, she said. It was a debt transfer. My father owed money to a man named Arthur Vance. When my father died, Vance decided the debt could be settled in other ways. She said it flat, the way she'd learned to say it without the weight of it in her voice, because carrying the weight of it in her voice gave people something to react to, and reactions cost her control of the conversation. I disagreed. Caldwell was very still. I left, she said again. I took what was mine, which was not much, but was mine, and I left, and I've been moving since then. How long ago? 8 months. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Vance. Is that who Harp's working for? I believe so. You believe or you know? I know, she said. I just can't prove it yet. He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that meant he was absorbing something and filing it in the same methodical way he filed everything. Then, the territorial inquiry. I want you to write it. She hadn't expected that either. I thought you were thinking on it. I thought on it, he said. Write it. I'll send Cord to Creston by end of the week. He turned to go, stopped at the door. And without turning back, looking at the doorframe instead, or maybe just at the dark beyond it, he said, Vance isn't going to get paper that holds on this range. I want you to know that. Emily stood very still. Mr. Caldwell. Why? A beat. Because you found $40 I didn't know I was missing and put your name on the documentation before you brought it to me. He paused again. That kind of work deserves a place to stand. He walked out. Emily stood in the supply house alone for a moment, in the particular silence that follows when something has shifted without either person naming it out loud. She looked at the open ledger, at the marks she'd made in her own careful hand, at the months of work that was now laid bare and clean, the way things should always be when someone looks at them honestly. She thought about the way he'd said it. That kind of work deserves a place to stand. Not you deserve a place, not I'll protect you, or you're safe here now. The work. He'd spoken about the work. And somehow that was more grounding than anything else he could have said, because it meant the foundation was not mercy or pity, or someone else's decision about what she was owed. It was what she had done. It was hers. She closed the ledger. She set it straight on the shelf. She walked out into the night air of Millbrook Station and stood for a moment under a sky that was thick with stars, the way mountain skies got extravagant and indifferent and enormous. She breathed. Deacon Hart came back on a Thursday. He didn't come alone. He had 6 men this time, 4 she hadn't seen before, and 2 she recognized from the road. And he had a paper in his hand that he was holding up before he'd even fully cleared the gate, the way men hold things when they want the thing to do, the work of speaking for them. Emily was in the yard. She'd been carrying a supply log from the house to the supply barn, and she was standing in the open with no particular cover between her and the gate when Hart rode through. She did not move. She did not look for an exit. She had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do in front of a man like Hart was look like you were calculating an escape route, because that told him he had power over your movement, and she was not going to give him that. "Caldwell's not here," she said. Her voice was even. "He rode out at dawn with his men." Hart pulled up in the yard and looked down at her from the saddle, with the particular expression of a man who has decided the outcome already and is just here to collect it. "Don't need Caldwell," he said. "Got a territorial endorsement this time." He held the paper out. "You want to read it, or you want to save us both the time?" Emily set down her supply log. She walked to him. She held her hand up for the paper. After a beat, because he hadn't expected her to actually reach for it, he handed it down. She read it. She read it carefully, the way her father had taught her to read legal documents, not for what they said, but for what they didn't say, for the gaps in the language, for the places where the form deviated from standard. She read it twice. Then she handed it back. "The endorsement date is the 14th, she said. "The county filing date is the 3rd. She held his gaze. Territorial endorsements have to precede county execution under Section 12 of the Territorial Land Code. This endorsement came 11 days after the county filing. That makes the county filing void." She paused. "The paper isn't good, Mr. Hart." The yard was very quiet. One of the men behind Hart shifted in his saddle. Another one looked at his hands. Hart stared at her. A muscle in his jaw moved. "That's a creative reading," he said, slow and deliberate. "It's the statutory reading," Emily said. "I'd be happy to show you the relevant section. I have it copied in the supply house." "You have it." He stopped. Something moved across his face. Not respect men like Hart didn't get there, but something adjacent to the awareness that he had miscalculated the situation. "Who are you?" "I keep the books," Emily said. "And the law, apparently." "Emily." The voice came from behind her. She turned. James Caldwell was standing at the corner of the main house. He had not ridden out at dawn. He had been here somewhere on the property, and he had let this play out, and she couldn't decide yet whether that made her angry or something else. His eyes were on Hart. "You heard her," he said. Hart looked at Caldwell. Looked at Emily. Looked at the paper in his hand, like it had personally failed him. "This isn't done, Caldwell." "No," Caldwell agreed in that flat, closed-sentence way. "It's not." He walked forward until he was standing in the yard, equidistant from Emily and from Hart. "But it's done for today. Take your men off my land." The silence stretched. Then Hart turned his horse around, and his men turned with him, and they rode out through the gate. Emily stood watching them go, her hands loose at her sides, her heart doing something loud and uneven inside her chest that she was not going to let show on her face. Caldwell stopped beside her. She could feel him there without looking. The same quality of presence she'd noticed on the road, not loud, not demanding, just solid. Like a post sunk deep enough that nothing was going to move it. "You were here the whole time," she said. "I was in the barn. You let me handle it." A pause. "You were handling it." She looked at him then. He was looking at the gate where Hart had gone, and his expression was what it always was, controlled, reading something, giving nothing away, gratuitously. But there was something underneath it this time. Something she couldn't quite name. "I was afraid," she said. She said it because it was true, and because she was so tired of carrying true things in silence. "My hands are still shaking." He looked at her, down at her hands, then back up. "I know," he said. "You could have come out sooner." "I could have," he said, "but you didn't need me to." She wanted to argue with that. She ran the argument through her head. "Of course, I needed you." There were 6 of them. I was alone in that yard, and then she stopped, because what she'd actually done was hold her ground and use what she knew and make Hart back down without a single person raising a hand. And the honest truth was that she had not needed him to do that. She'd needed to do it herself, and somewhere in the part of him that was methodical and precise and gave nothing away that wasn't meant to be given, he had understood that. "The inquiry to Creston," she said finally. "Did Cord go?" "Yesterday?" Caldwell said. "Good." She picked up her supply log from where she'd set it in the dirt. "Then we should have something back in a week." She started toward the supply barn. "Miss Hart?" She stopped. Didn't turn. "You've been here less than 2 weeks," he said. "And you just held off 6 men with a paper I've been trying to build a case against for months." She turned then. He was still standing in the yard, and the morning was full around him, and he looked like something that had grown out of this land rather than arrived in it. "I had the right section memorized," she said. "Why? Because I knew he'd come back." She paused. "And I don't like being unprepared." The silence between them had a different quality now than it had at the beginning. Less careful, less armored. Like 2 people who have been in the same difficult place and come out the same side and are only now starting to account for what that means. "Supper's at 6, he said. "I know," she said. "Tonight I'll be at the table," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she turned and walked to the supply barn, and she did not look back, and she was smiling in a way she had not smiled in a very long time. Small and private and entirely her own. The kind of smile that doesn't need an audience because it isn't performing anything. It's just real. He was at the table that night. It shouldn't have mattered. It was supper. 6 people at a long table, same as every other night. But the empty chair at the end was filled now, and the quality of the room changed the way a room changes when the person who owns the weight of a place finally sits down in it. Nobody made a thing of it. That was what struck Emily most. Pete passed the bread without comment. Cord kept his eyes on his plate. Mrs. Ames refilled the coffee the way she refilled it every night. And James Caldwell sat at the head of that table and ate his supper and said exactly 4 words during the entire meal, which were, "Pass the salt, Duff," and somehow the whole room breathed easier for his being there. Emily ate and watched without appearing to watch, which was a skill she had developed over years of needing to understand rooms she'd been placed in without being consulted. She understood this one. Millbrook ran on Caldwell. Not because he demanded it, she'd seen men who demanded it, and they had a particular kind of energy that this man didn't have, a hunger for being central, that wore itself in how they entered rooms and how long they held eye contact. Caldwell wasn't like that. He was central the way a load-bearing wall was central. You didn't notice it until you thought about what the structure would do without it. After supper, when the others had drifted out and Mrs. Ames was stacking plates with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, Caldwell pushed back from the table and looked at Emily. "Cord gets back from Creston in 5 days," he said. "If the territorial records show what you think they show, I need someone who can read the response and tell me immediately." "I'll be here," Emily said. "I know." He stood. "Bring the supply discrepancy documentation to the study tomorrow morning. I want to go through it before I decide what to do about Garrett." 7 or 8? She asked. He paused at the doorway. The question seemed to surprise him slightly, The practicality of it, maybe the fact that she was already thinking about the morning. 7, he said. I'll have coffee ready. Mrs. Ames said to neither of them specifically, in the tone of a woman who has managed the logistics of human beings for decades and finds them mostly predictable. Caldwell left. Emily carried her plate to the basin, and Lila, who had a genius for appearing exactly when something worth noticing had just happened, appeared in the kitchen doorway with a length of mending in her hands and an expression of studied neutrality on her face. He hasn't eaten at that table on a weeknight in 4 months, Lila said. Lila, Mrs. Ames said. I'm just saying, Lila said and disappeared again. Emily looked at the basin. She was not going to assign meaning to a man eating supper at his own table. She was going to go to bed and get up at 5 and make the coffee and do the work. That was what she was here for. That was the ground she stood on. She went to bed. She lay awake for an hour staring at the ceiling, which she chose to attribute entirely to the altitude. The 7 o'clock meeting in the study became a daily thing, though neither of them said it was. It started with the Garrett documentation. Then there was the supply account restructuring. Then there was a boundary dispute with a neighboring operation called the Rafter Tea that had been simmering for 2 seasons and had generated a stack of correspondence that nobody had organized into anything coherent. Emily organized it in 2 days, wrote a summary of the legal standing on both sides, and presented it to Caldwell on a Friday morning with a recommendation she'd reached entirely on her own without being asked for one. He read it again, said, "You weren't asked for a recommendation." "I know," she said. "Do you want me to remove it?" A pause. "No." She did not smile. She waited. "The Rafter Tea boundary runs off a creek survey from 1871, he said. "Survey's probably wrong. Creeks moved. They know it, and we know it, and nobody wants to pay for a resurvey." "I know," Emily said. "That's what the recommendation addresses." "You think we should split the resurvey cost?" "I think splitting it costs less than 2 more seasons of legal correspondence, and it gives you a clean line you can defend at the territorial level if Harp's operation ever tries to use the ambiguity." She paused. "But it's your land." Caldwell set the paper down, looked at her with that measuring look that she no longer found unsettling, had stopped finding unsettling about 4 days in, if she was honest with herself. "You think about the Harp situation constantly," he said. "Don't you?" she said. "Yes," he said. "But I've had a year to get used to it." "I've had less time and more personal investment," she said. "That tends to focus the mind." Something shifted in his expression. The thing she'd been learning to read, the almost acknowledgement, the not quite response, was there again, but this time it was accompanied by something quieter. Something that was not quite concern, but was in the neighborhood of it. "How personal," he said. It was a careful question. She recognized the care in it the way he'd asked it without asking her to produce more than she wanted to give. She thought about what to say. She thought about the version of the story she'd been telling, the compressed professional version: "I was in a bad arrangement and I left." Clean. Sufficient. Not a lie. Then she thought about the way he'd stood in that yard when Harp rode out, and the way he'd said that kind of work deserves a place to stand, and she thought about what it cost to keep carrying a thing in the compressed version when the person across from you had already earned more than the compressed version. "Vance had my father's signature on a debt instrument from 10 years ago, she said. "By the time my father died, the interest had compounded to more than my father's estate was worth. Vance told me the debt transferred to me as my father's only heir." She kept her voice even. "He said the most practical resolution was for me to marry into his business arrangement. He had a partner, a man named Renfield, 47 years old, who needed a wife who could keep accounts and manage a household and not ask too many questions." Caldwell was very still. "I asked questions," Emily said. "That was the first problem. The second problem was that when I looked at the actual debt instrument, the interest calculation was wrong. Deliberately wrong. My father's estate, properly liquidated, would have covered the principal and the legitimate interest with $40 to spare." She paused. "I told Vance that." "What did he say?" Caldwell asked. He said a woman's reading of a financial instrument wasn't legally admissible in a debt proceeding. She looked at her hands, then back up. He was right technically, which is why I left instead of arguing. Caldwell said nothing for a moment. The study was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that comes in the early morning before the working day has fully started, the particular quality of a room where someone has been sitting alone with hard things for a long time. He came after you, Caldwell said. It wasn't a question. He sent people, Emily said. I moved fast enough to stay ahead of them until Delacourt. In Delacourt, I found Mrs. Ames's advertisement. She paused. I had $11 and a letter of introduction and boots that were losing the argument with the road. Millbrook Station was as far as I could go and still be going somewhere. The silence after that was different from his other silences. This one had weight to it. The weight of someone taking in something real and not rushing to fill it with reaction. The debt instrument, he said finally. Do you still have it? She looked at him. I kept a copy. His eyes sharpened. You kept a copy. I kept two, she said. One is in my room. One is in a place I won't tell you about because if something happens to me, I need there to be a copy that survives regardless. The stillness in him went absolute. Emily. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Neither of them noted it aloud, but it sat in the air of the study and changed something about the room. I've been careful for 8 months, she said. Being careful is the only reason I'm here. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said. Mr. Caldwell. James, he said. We're past titles in this room, I think. She stopped, looked at him. He looked back, and his expression was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the controlled assessment, not the flat authority, not the almost acknowledgement. This was something open, not vulnerable, because she suspected this man had made himself the kind of person who couldn't be taken by surprise from the inside. But open, present, like a door that had been built with a lock so fine you'd never noticed it was there until the moment it was standing open. James, she said. She tried it out. It fit differently than she'd expected. The copy in the land office can wait. What can't wait is Cord's return from Creston. If the filing dates don't match, they won't, he said with a certainty that wasn't arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who has been watching a pattern long enough to know how it ends. Then we take the discrepancy to the Territorial Land Commissioner, Emily said. Not the county. The territorial level voids the county filing retroactively, and it creates a record that Vance can't paper over. She paused. But we need to move fast. If Hart knows we sent someone to Creston, he'll try to amend the filing before Cord gets back. Hart doesn't know Cord went for the records, James said. How sure are you? A beat. Sure enough. He looked at her. How do you know this much about territorial filing procedure? My father fought a boundary dispute for 3 years when I was 16, she said. I read every document. I went to every proceeding I was allowed into, and some I wasn't. She paused. I learned that the law is a language. If you can read it, you can use it. If you can't, someone else uses it on you. James was quiet for a moment. Then, Vance could read it. Vance could pay people who could read it, she said. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It's not. He stood. Walked to the window, not looking out at anything in particular she'd come to understand, just the way he moved when he was thinking, the way some people pace and some people go still. He went to windows. I'm going to need you in Creston, he said. What? When Cord gets back with the records. If what you think is there, I'll need someone who can read it in front of the commissioner and argue the case. He turned back. That's not Pete. It's not Cord. It's not me. He paused. It's you. Emily sat with that for a moment. Creston is 3 days' ride, she said. Yes. Vance's people will know if I leave Millbrook. Yes, he said again. Which is why you wouldn't leave alone. He said it flatly, like a logistical fact, which is what it was, and somehow that was both more and less than if he'd said it any other way. She looked at him. You'd go yourself. It's my land on the line, he said. And he stopped. Whatever the second thing was, he folded it back. She noted the fold. She filed it. All right, she said. When Cord gets back, we go over the records together first. If it's what we think, we ride to Creston. She picked up her papers, stood. I'll have the Rafter T summary ready for your signature by noon. If you want to propose the split resurvey, we should do it before the season pushes into the heat peak and their crew is stretched. You're already on to the next thing, he said. Not a criticism. Just an observation delivered with something that was almost wonder, almost amusement, and entirely quiet. There's always a next thing, Emily said. She walked to the door. She felt him watching her go, not the way Harp's men watched, not the way the card players in Harrow's Notch had watched. This was different. This was the way a person watches something they're still figuring out, not to possess it or to judge it, but because it interests them in the deep, genuine way that only real things interest a person who doesn't settle for surfaces. She did not turn around, but she felt it. Cord came back in 4 days, not 5. He rode in late afternoon, looking like the road had argued with him, and he'd won, but just barely, and he had a leather satchel strapped across his chest that he handed directly to Emily, not to James, because James had told him to bring it to the ledger keeper. Emily took it to the study. James came in behind her. She was already untying the satchel. The territorial records were exactly what she'd expected them to be, and worse, not one fraudulent filing. 7 county filings across the Caldwell Range boundary, all dated within the past 14 months, all with territorial endorsements that post-dated the county execution, some by days, 2 of them by more than 3 weeks. Every single one of them void under Section 12. But that wasn't what stopped her cold. What stopped her cold was the name on 3 of the filings. Not Harp, not Vance. A land-holding company called Meridian Territorial Trust, registered in the county land office 9 months ago. And the registered agent for Meridian Territorial Trust was a man named Samuel Garrett. She sat very still. James was reading over her shoulder. She felt him stop too. Garrett, he said. He didn't just steal $40, Emily said. Her voice was very level. This was the kind of thing you had to keep your voice level for, because if you let the implications of it spread into your chest all at once, you'd lose the ability to think clearly, and right now she needed to think clearly more than she'd needed to in 8 months. He set up a land-holding company before he left. He's been feeding information to Vance's operation, which filing windows were open, which boundary surveys were out of date, where the gaps in the territorial record were. He was inside Millbrook for 2 years, James said. Then he left in April, and the filing started in May, Emily said. He didn't leave because he knew I was coming. He left because the operation was ready to move. James straightened. She heard the breath he took slow and controlled the way someone breathes when they are managing something large and are not going to let it manage them. She recognized that breath. She'd been taking it for 8 months. Miss Hart, he said. And just like that, they were back to titles because something had become serious enough that informality felt wrong. I know, she said. He knows this ranch. Every water source, every access road, every... I know, she said again. James. His name deliberately, because she needed him to hear it from her as a steadying thing, not a formal thing. We have the evidence. All 7 filings are void. If we get this to the Territorial Commissioner before Vance can move Garrett's company assets, we don't just void the filings, we expose the scheme, the whole thing. Garrett could be anywhere. He could, she said. But his company assets are registered in the county. Those don't move fast. She was already pulling paper toward her. I need to write the commissioner's brief tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. You need to look at it by morning, and we need to ride by noon. That's 5 hours of writing, James said. Then you should let me start, Emily said. He didn't move. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, and it took her a moment to name it, because it was not a common thing on his face. It was something close to fierce. not angry. Protective, but not the kind of protective that wanted to put her behind him. The kind that recognized what she was and was prepared to stand next to it. "I'll get Mrs. Ames to bring food," he said. "You're not writing 5 hours on an empty stomach." "That's practical," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." He left. She heard him in the hallway, heard him call for Mrs. Ames. Heard the low exchange of voices that she couldn't make out. Then quiet. And then Mrs. Ames appeared in the doorway, with bread and cold meat and a pot of coffee, and the expression of a woman who has understood exactly what is happening and has decided it is her job to make sure it happens correctly. "Whatever you're doing in here," Mrs. Ames said, setting the tray down, "do it right." "I intend to," Emily said. Mrs. Ames left. Emily uncapped her pen. She looked at the stack of territorial records at the 7 void filings at the name Samuel Garrett, repeating across 3 of them like a thread she could pull until everything unraveled. She started writing. James came back an hour later and sat across the table from her without a word, and he read the records she'd already processed while she wrote the ones she hadn't reached yet. And the study filled up with the particular quality of 2 people working a hard problem in the same direction at the same time. Not in tandem, not by design, but because the problem required it, and they were both the kind of people who go toward hard things rather than away from them. At some point, she didn't track when he refilled her coffee without being asked. She looked up. He was already back to the records. She looked down. She kept writing. The brief was done at midnight. 12 pages. Clear argument statutory references, exhibit list 7 void filings, marked with the specific Section 12 violations, and a concluding paragraph that named the Meridian Territorial Trust and its registered agent and recommended an immediate freeze on county land office activity under that registration pending territorial investigation. She set her pen down, flexed her hand, which had gone stiff somewhere around page 9. James took the brief, read it front to back. She watched his face move through it, the small compressions and releases, the moments where something sharpened or settled. He turned the last page over. Set it down. "This is good," he said. "It's thorough," she said. "I don't know if it's good until the commissioner reads it." "It's good," he said again, with the flat certainty he used for things he'd already decided. "And you know it." She was too tired to argue. She looked at the table, at the spread of documents, and her own pages, dense with careful language, at the cold remains of the food Mrs. Ames had left. Outside, the night was full and dark, and somewhere in it, Millbrook Station breathed in its sleep cattle and horses, and the distant sound of the wind over the canyon edge. "I need to ask you something," James said. She looked at him. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the brief, and he was looking at her directly. "When this is over," he said, "when the commissioner voids the filings and Vance loses his legal avenue, what do you do?" The question sat in the air between them. She had not been asked that question in 8 months. She had been asked where she was going, what she needed, whether she had resources, whether she had contacts. She had not been asked what she did when the immediate threat was resolved, because nobody had assumed she'd get that far. "I haven't thought about it," she said, which was partly true. She'd been too busy surviving the present tense to build a future tense. "You should think about it," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them burned low, and his face in it was very still, very present. "Because the decision should be yours," he said. "Not Vance's, not Harp's, not mine." He paused. "I want to make sure you know that." Emily Hart sat across a table from James Caldwell at midnight with 12 pages of her best work between them, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months, and maybe longer than that, the particular sensation of being seen as a person who had a future, not just a problem to be solved, or a situation to be managed, or a resource to be used. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was very careful about the moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'd like to finish the ledger restructuring before I decide anything else." The corner of his mouth did that thing. "That'll take another 3 weeks," he said. At least, she said, I keep finding new problems. You keep finding my problems, he said, and fixing them. That is the job, she said. Yes, he said. And then, I'm glad you took it. She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp burned between them, and outside Millbrook breathed, and neither of them moved for a moment that was long enough to mean something, and short enough that neither of them had to name what it meant. Then Emily picked up the brief, stacked it neatly, set it next to the exhibit file. We ride at noon, she said. Noon, he agreed. She stood. Her legs were stiff, and her hand ached, and she was exhausted down to something below bone. But she was also more awake than she'd been in 8 months, the particular aliveness of a person who has done something real and knows it, and is only beginning to understand what comes next. She walked to the door. Emily. She stopped. Didn't turn immediately. Let herself stand in that pause for one breath, just one, before she turned and looked at him. He was still at the table, still in the low light. His expression was what it always was, at its most unguarded, not soft, not dramatic, just present, just real. Get some sleep, he said. She let the not quite smile come. You too, she said. She walked out. She climbed the stairs. She lay down on her narrow bed in the second room on the left, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about 12 pages of her best work, and 7 void filings, and a man who had refilled her coffee at midnight without saying a word about it. She was asleep in 4 minutes. For the first time in 8 months, she did not dream about running. They rode out at noon with the brief in a sealed leather case strapped to James's saddle, and 4 days of supplies on the pack horse that Cord led from behind. Pete stayed at Millbrook with Mrs. Ames and Lila and Duff, and James had given Pete a single set of instructions before they left, that Emily had only partially heard something about the north gate and rotating the watch, and the way Pete had nodded told her it wasn't the first time those instructions had been given. Millbrook was not unguarded. James had thought about this before she had. She noted that without surprise. She was beginning to understand that James Caldwell thought about most things before other people did. He just didn't announce it. The first day's ride was long and mostly silent, in the way their silences had become not uncomfortable, not avoidant, but the silence of 2 people who had found that they didn't need to fill space with sound to maintain connection. Emily rode a steady roan mare that the ranch kept for supply runs, and she rode her well enough that James didn't offer advice, which she appreciated more than he probably knew. They made camp the first night at the base of a granite shelf that blocked the worst of the canyon wind. Cord built the fire and put water on and disappeared into a tactful distance with his bedroll, and Emily was aware in the specific bodily way she'd become aware of things over 8 months of needing to track her surroundings carefully, that the camp had been arranged so that she was between the fire and the granite wall with James and Cord on the outer sides. It had not been discussed. It had simply been done. She heated her hands on the tin cup and thought about whether to say anything about it, and decided against. Some things were better received as what they were. How long has Hart been working the county? She asked. James was looking at the fire the way he looked at windows in the study. Not at the thing itself, but past it, through it, using it as a surface to think against. 2 years best I can tell. He came in as deputy and got the star inside 6 months. The man he pushed out filed a complaint with the territorial marshal, and nothing came of it. The territorial marshal is clean, far as I know. He looked at her. You're thinking the commissioner might not be. I'm thinking we should be prepared for it, Emily said. If Vance has reach into the county land office, he may have reach further up. James was quiet. If the commissioner is bought, we have a problem. We go above the commissioner, Emily said. Territorial judge has standing to order an emergency land freeze independent of the commissioner. It takes longer, but it holds harder. You know territorial judges. I know the statute that governs their authority, she said. I don't need to know the man if I know the law. James looked at her for a moment. You prepared for both scenarios, he said. Before we left. I wrote 2 versions of the brief, she said. The second one's in the bottom of the case under the first. Different letterhead addressed to Judge Harlan Moss in the territorial capital. The silence that followed had that particular weight again, the weight of someone recalibrating. She'd been getting that from him with some regularity, and she'd stopped feeling self-conscious about it and started feeling something closer to the simple satisfaction of being understood correctly. "You did that last night," he said, "after I told you to sleep." "Before I slept," she said. "It took 20 minutes." "Emily." "It was 20 minutes," she said. "I timed it." He shook his head. Not in frustration. In the way someone shakes their head when they've given up arguing with a force of nature and have made their peace with it. She found she liked that particular headshake more than she had any reason to. Cord, from his tactful distance, made a sound that might have been a cough and was probably a laugh. Yet, they were 4 hours out of Creston on the second day when they found Garrett. Not by design, not because they were looking for him. He was on the side road that cut up from the south, a man on a tired horse going in the same direction they were, and Emily would have passed him entirely if she hadn't looked at his hands when he pulled up to let their group pass, and recognized the way a man holds the reins when he's been riding scared. She looked at his face. Something landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. "James," she said quietly. Just his name. He'd already seen it. He was already pulling the bay around. Garrett was maybe 40, with a face that had been ordinary once, and had gotten mean the way faces do when the choices that made them mean have been made long enough that they've set. He recognized James Caldwell before Caldwell had fully turned the horse, and he made the mistake that scared men always make. He pulled his horse around to run before he'd thought about whether running was actually possible. Cord was faster. He cut wide and came around the side road ahead of Garrett before Garrett's horse had taken 4 strides, and the tired horse didn't have anything left to argue the point with. Garrett pulled up. His horse heaved under him. James rode to him without hurrying. He stopped the bay close, not threatening, just present the way walls are present. "Samuel," he said. Garrett's eyes moved to Emily. Something went through his face. Recognition calculation, and something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like relief, which made no sense until he opened his mouth. "I was coming to you," Garrett said. He was breathing fast. "I was already coming." "To me," James said flatly. "To Caldwell land. To whoever I didn't know she was going to be." He stopped, looked at Emily again. "You found the accounts." "I found the accounts," Emily confirmed. "And the Meridian filings." Garrett closed his eyes briefly. "Then it's over anyway." He opened them, looked at James. "I'll testify. Whatever you need. I'll testify against all of it, Vance Harp, the land office contact. All of it." The road was very quiet. Emily looked at James. James was looking at Garrett with the expression he used for things that required careful handling, controlled reading, not yet decided. "Why?" James said. "Because Vance is done with me," Garrett said, and the fear in his voice was real enough that it didn't need performance. "He found out I kept a copy of the Meridian Incorporation documents. He thinks I'm going to use them to protect myself. He sent 2 men to my rooming house in Creston 3 days ago." He paused. They weren't there to talk. Emily said, "You ran." "I ran," Garrett said. He said it without shame, which she respected more than false bravado would have earned. "I'm not a brave man. I knew what I was getting into with Vance, and I did it anyway because the money was good, and I told myself it was just paperwork. It was just filings. Nobody was actually getting hurt." He stopped, swallowed. "Then I saw what was in the filings, what he was actually trying to do to this range, to the people working it." His eyes went to Emily again, and this time what was in them was something specific. "I heard what he'd done to your father's estate. Vance told Harp about it, bragged about it." His jaw tightened. "I'm not going to be the man who helps him do that to someone else." The silence after that was the longest of the journey. James looked at Emily. She looked back. This was the kind of moment that required 2 people to read each other rather than the situation, because the situation was straightforward. A cooperating witness with inside knowledge was an extraordinary asset. But the person in front of them was not a straightforward case, and they both knew it. She gave the smallest nod she had. James looked back at Garrett. "You ride with us to Creston," he said. "You stay where I can see you. You repeat everything you just said to the Territorial Commissioner under oath with your name on it." He paused. "You try to run again and I let you go. But then you're on your own with whatever Vance sends next." Garrett nodded. "Yes, sir." "And Garrett." James waited until the man looked at him fully. "The $40. Garrett's face went through something complicated. "I'll pay it back." "With interest," James said. "Supply rate." "Yes, sir," Garrett said again, quieter this time, the sound of a man who has been given a harder mercy than he deserved and knows it. They rode the last 4 hours to Creston in a group of 4. The Territorial Commissioner's office was on the second floor of a limestone building that smelled like old paper and authority. The commissioner himself was a man named Aldous Webb, 60-something, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent 40 years watching people come through that door, wanting things. He looked at the 4 of them, Emily, James, Cord, and Garrett, with the measured patience of a man who had seen stranger combinations. Emily set the leather case on his desk and opened it. She took out the brief, set it in front of him. 12 pages, she said. Exhibits begin on page 8. The critical dates are marked in the margins. Webb looked at her, looked at James. "And you are?" "Emily Hart," she said. "I keep the books for Caldwell Range, and I keep the law, apparently." She said it the same way she'd said it to Harp, and the commissioner's expression shifted in a way that suggested he found it either impressive or alarming, possibly both. "She wrote it," James said. "I read it. It's correct." Webb picked up the brief, started reading. The room was very quiet. Cord stood by the door. Garrett sat in the chair against the wall and looked at his hands. James stood next to Emily close enough that she was aware of the specific solidity of him not touching, not hovering just there. Webb turned to page 3, turned to page 5, slowed at page 8 where the exhibits began. "Section 12 violations," he said, not looking up. "7 of them," Emily said. "Filing dates and endorsement dates don't align. The county execution preceded the territorial endorsement in every case. The earliest gap is 4 days, the longest is 23. Webb set the brief down. "Who compiled the records comparison?" "I did," Emily said, "from the Territorial Registry, your office's own records commissioner." Webb looked at Garrett. "And you are?" "Samuel Garrett," Garrett said. His voice was steadier than Emily expected. "Former supply manager at Caldwell Range, registered agent for the Meridian Territorial Trust." He paused. "And I'd like to make a formal statement." Something moved behind Webb's careful eyes. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper. What followed was 3 hours that Emily would later describe to Mrs. Ames in the compressed and practical way she described things as the most legally productive afternoon of her life. Garrett's statement was thorough in the way that frightened men's statements are thorough. He'd been holding it in for months, and once he started, he didn't stop. He named names. He gave dates. He described the mechanism by which Harp fed information to Vance's operation. How the county land office contact a clerk named Fellows had been generating backdated documents for 18 months. How the Meridian Trust had been set up specifically to absorb Caldwell Range parcels once the fraudulent filings voided the existing boundary claims. It was, Emily thought, a more complete picture than even she had built from the ledger records. And at the center of it, as she had known, as James had known, was Arthur Vance. Webb filled 4 pages of notes. He sent a runner to the Territorial Marshal's office before Garrett was halfway through. By the time the statement was signed and witnessed, there were 2 territorial deputies in the room and a warrant in progress for Deacon Harp and the clerk named Fellows, and a third name. Emily hadn't known a judge in the county court who had been providing legal cover for the filing scheme in exchange for a land parcel in his own name. A bought judge. She had been right to prepare the second brief. She didn't say that aloud. When it was over and they were standing in the corridor outside Webb's office, Cord let out a long, slow breath, like he'd been holding it for 3 hours, which he possibly had been. Garrett sat on a bench against the wall, looking like a man who has put down something very heavy and isn't sure yet whether his hands work without it. James looked at Emily. She was looking at the closed door of Webb's office, listening to the sounds of institutional machinery beginning to turn the runner's feet on the stairs, the low, urgent voices of the deputies, the particular organized urgency of a situation that has moved from potential to actual. 8 months of being one step ahead of something terrible, and now the thing behind her was being dealt with by people whose job it was to deal with it, and she was standing in a corridor in Creston with cracked boots she'd replaced twice since Harrow's notch, and a hand that still ached from 12 pages at midnight, and she didn't know exactly what to do with the feeling in her chest. "Emily," James said. She turned. He was closer than he usually stood, which for James Caldwell meant close enough that she could see the tiredness and the relief, and the other thing, the thing that had been building in the corner of his expressions for 2 weeks, all of it present at once in his face. "It's going to hold," he said. "I know," she said. "Vance can't paper his way out of a witness statement and 7 void filings in front of a territorial commissioner." "I know," she said again. "You're safe," he said. And then because he was James, and he didn't leave important things in the passive voice, "You're safe here, at Millbrook, as long as you want to be." She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was moving around them. Deputies, the runner returning a clerk with papers, and they were standing still in the middle of it, the way 2 people stand still when the world is moving, and the thing between them requires stillness to be handled correctly. "That's not a business offer," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. You're not." She stopped. Started again because she was a person who said true things, and this was a true thing. "You're not offering me safety in exchange for work." "I'm offering you both," he said. "Separately. The work stands on its own. It always did." He paused. "The other thing is different." "The other thing," she repeated. He held her gaze. "I'm not good at the words for it," he said in the flat, honest way he said things he found difficult. "I know what I see when I look at you. I know what it's felt like having you in that study at 7 in the morning for 2 weeks. I know that last night when I thought about writing back to Millbrook without knowing what you were going to choose to do, I didn't sleep." He stopped. "That's all I've got. It ain't much in the way of poetry." Emily Hart stood in a corridor in Creston, 4 days' ride from the place she'd ended up, when she had nowhere left to go, and she looked at a man who had never once tried to own her or manage her, or reduce her to the sum of her usefulness, who had handed her a problem and stepped back and let her solve it, who had refilled her coffee at midnight and ridden 4 days to a territorial commissioner and stood next to her while she laid out the case. And she thought about what it meant to choose something because you wanted it, and not because you had no other choice. She had other choices now. The legal threat was dissolving in the room behind that closed door. She had skills and a reputation. Webb had asked for her name twice, and the second time he'd written it down. She could go to Delacourt or further east or anywhere. A woman with clean ledgers and territorial land law memorized could build a working life. She could go anywhere. She looked at James. "The Rafter T resurvey proposal," she said. "Did you send it?" He blinked, just barely. "Before we left?" "Did they respond?" "Not yet." "Then I need to be there when they do," she said. "Because if they push back on the cost split, I have 3 alternative structures ready, and I'd like to be the one who presents them." Something moved through his face, starting at the eyes, reaching the corner of his mouth, settling into something that was the full version of the thing she'd been watching almost appear for 2 weeks. Not a small private shift. A real one. A James Caldwell smile, which was quiet and rare, and apparently worth every day it had taken to see it. "That'll take another month minimum," he said. "At least," she said. "And then there's the full territorial filing to reclassify the boundary surveys. That's probably 6 weeks of correspondence. And after that?" She met his eyes. "Ask me after that," she said, "and I'll give you a straight answer." He nodded. Once. The nod that meant understood, accepted. "I'll hold that." "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Cord cleared his throat from a diplomatic distance of about 10 feet. "Pardon the interruption," he said in the tone of a man interrupting something he has absolutely noticed and will absolutely not mention to anyone. "Deputy wants to know if we're staying the night or riding back today." James looked at Emily. "You're tired," he said. It was an observation, not a judgment. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Emily." She stopped. He was right. She was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been running on tension for days and has just felt the tension release, and the body presents the bill immediately. "One night," she said, "we ride at first light." James turned to Cord. "One night," he said. "Tell the deputy we'll need—" "Already found a boarding house," Cord said, with the efficiency of someone who had been handling logistics for this operation long enough to stay ahead of it. "3-room supper included." He paused. "Miss Hart gets the one with the proper lock." Emily looked at Cord. He was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has decided that the ceiling is very interesting. "Thank you, Cord," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said to the ceiling. She didn't sleep well. Not because she was afraid the fear that had been the background noise of 8 months had quieted to something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Something that might with time resolve into ordinary calm. She didn't sleep well because her mind was doing what it always did when a major problem had been resolved. It was already 3 problems ahead, cataloging what came next, running the sequences. The territorial proceedings would take weeks. Webb had said he'd have the void findings formalized within 10 days, which would be sent to the county and to the territorial marshal simultaneously. Harp would be removed. Fellows would be arrested. The bought judge was a more complicated matter. Judicial removal required a territorial review board, but Webb had said the evidence was sufficient to initiate it, and that was sufficient for now. Vance was in Delacourt. He was not in her range. She lay in the dark boarding house room and thought about that. Vance in Delacourt 3 days from Millbrook with his legal avenue collapsing and his scheme exposed and a cooperating witness who knew every mechanism of what he'd built. Men like Vance didn't absorb that quietly. Men like Vance found other avenues. She was out of bed before she'd fully decided to be. She wrapped her blanket around her shoulders, took her candle to the small desk in the corner of the room, and wrote 3 pages of notes about what Vance's remaining options were and which ones constituted the most immediate risk to Millbrook Range. She organized them by likelihood and by the speed at which each one could be countered. She was on the 2nd page when she heard a knock at her door. Soft, not urgent, but deliberate. "Yes?" she said. "It's me," James said. She opened the door. He was in the hallway in his work shirt, no hat, looking like a man who had also not been sleeping. He looked at the candle, at the papers on the desk visible behind her. "You're working," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "Same thing." He looked at her for a moment. "I couldn't sleep either," he said. "I kept thinking about what Vance does next." "I'm writing that down right now," she said. He almost laughed. It was a very quiet, almost laugh, barely audible, but she heard it, and it did something to the space behind her ribs that she was going to have to think about later when she had time to think about it properly. "May I?" he said, gesturing to the chair at the desk. She stepped back. He came in and sat, and she handed him the pages she'd written, and he read them while she kept writing, and the boarding house room in Creston was very small, and the candle between them was very low, and outside the mountain night was cold and complete, and entirely indifferent to the 2 people sitting at a small desk in the lamplight doing what they both apparently did when they couldn't sleep, which was work the problem and trust that the work was enough. "You've listed physical intimidation as the lowest probability response," he said. "Vance is a financial operator," she said without looking up from the page. "He doesn't use force when paper works. Now that paper doesn't work, he has to recalculate. That recalculation takes time. We have a window." "How long a window?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, she said. "Until word gets back to him definitively that the commissioner has formalized the void findings." She paused. "We should use that time to get the boundary surveys registered under the new filings. Clean record, clean line. Harder to attack. That's 6 weeks of work, James said. I know, she said. I'm fast. He set the pages down. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she'd seen in the corridor open, present the door that had been built with a lock so fine you didn't notice it until it was standing open. When we get back, he said, I want you to move your things to the main house. She stilled. There's a room off of the study, he said. Used to be a second office. It's got a better desk, better light. He paused. And it's closer to the gate, which means you'll hear if anyone comes in at night before Mrs. Ames does. She looked at him. That's practical, she said carefully. Yes, he said. It is. And then, it's also closer to me. He said it the same way he said everything that was difficult, straight flat, without decoration, offered plainly, and without pressure, take it or don't. I sleep better knowing you're not on the other side of the ranch. Emily set her pen down. James, she said. I know, he said. Ask me after the rafter tea survey. I remember. I was going to say yes, she said. To the room. He went very still. The desk in the supply house is too small for the territorial filing, she said. I've been making do, but the second office would be significantly more practical. She held his gaze. And I sleep better when I can hear the gate so. The quiet between them was the fullest quiet she'd heard since Millbrook. Not empty. Exactly the opposite. All right, he said. All right, she said. He stood, took his pages with him, her notes, her analysis, the 3 pages of what comes next that she'd been writing in a boarding house room at midnight in Creston with a candle burning low. He looked at them in his hand, and then he looked at her, and what was in his face was something she was going to carry for a long time. Not a declaration, not a promise in words. Something quieter and more durable than either. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said. He walked out. She closed the door. She stood for a moment in the room with the candle burning down, and the night outside, and the papers on the desk, and the particular feeling of something that has been broken for a long time, beginning slowly, and without fanfare to be put back together. She went to bed. She slept until first light, and when she came down to the boarding house kitchen in the morning, James was already there, 2 cups of coffee on the table, waiting in the particular way he waited for things. Not restless, not performing patience, just present. He pushed 1 cup toward her without a word. She sat down, wrapped her hands around it. Outside, Creston was waking up. Cord's boots sounded on the stairs. The horses would need watering. There was a 4-day ride back to Millbrook and 6 weeks of work waiting at the end of it, and Vance was still out there calculating his next move, and the territorial proceedings were still in motion, and none of it was finished yet. But the coffee was hot, and the man across the table from her was solid in the particular way of things that had been tested and had held. She drank. They rode out an hour later into a morning that was clear and sharp and smelled like pine resin and coming heat, and Emily Hart rode the roan mare with her back straight and her eyes forward, and the leather case strapped to James's saddle, carrying 12 pages that were already changing things, already doing their work, already making the ground under her feet something she had helped build rather than merely stumbled onto. Millbrook was 4 days ahead. She found she was glad about that in a way she hadn't expected to be glad about anything for a long time. They rode back into Millbrook on the 4th day at late afternoon, and the first thing Emily noticed was that Pete was standing at the gate with his hat in his hands. Pete never stood at the gate. Pete was always moving, fixing something, hauling something, talking to someone about something. Pete standing still with his hat in his hands meant something had happened while they were gone. James saw it at the same moment she did. He pushed the bay forward without a word. "What?" James said when they reached the gate. Pete looked at Emily first, then at James. "Letter came yesterday," he said. "Ryder brought it from Harrow's Notch. Said it was urgent and personal." He held it out. "It's addressed to Miss Hart, but it's got Vance's mark on the seal." The yard went very quiet. Emily leaned down from the roan and took the letter. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at the seal, a small pressed V in dark wax, the same mark she'd seen on every document Arthur Vance had ever put in front of her. Her stomach did something she refused to let reach her face. She broke the seal, opened it, read it. It was short. Arthur Vance wrote short when he was certain of himself, and he was clearly certain of himself in this letter, and what he was certain of was this. He knew she had gone to Creston. He knew she had a witness. And he was writing to inform her in the clipped professional language of a man who had spent 40 years using paper to take things from people that the witness in question, Samuel Garrett, had a prior fraud conviction in the territory of New Mexico from 11 years ago, which made his testimony inadmissible in a territorial proceeding under the character witness exclusion statute. Garrett had a prior conviction. Garrett had not mentioned a prior conviction. She read the letter twice. She handed it to James without comment. He read it. The muscle in his jaw moved. He handed it back. Is he right about the statute? I need to look at the exact language, Emily said. Her voice was even, completely even. But if the conviction was for fraud, specifically not theft, not violence fraud, then yes. Fraud conviction excludes a witness from testifying in a proceeding that involves fraudulent filings. It's a clean exclusion, no judicial discretion. So Garrett's statement, James said, may be inadmissible, Emily said, which means the 7 void filings stand on their own without corroboration, which is still enough for the commissioner to act on. She stopped. Thought. Unless Vance challenges the filing comparison on the grounds that the person who compiled it is the same person who brought the case, he could argue bias in the document review. Can he make that argument hold? With a Bott County judge, yes, she said. Which we don't have anymore. But the Territorial Review Board process for removing the judge takes time, and in that window, he files a challenge, James said. He files a challenge, she confirmed, and the commissioner has to hold the proceedings pending resolution. She looked at the letter in her hand. He thought about this before we even left Millbrook. He let us go to Creston. He let Garrett testify. Because he knew the testimony would be thrown out, and it would look like we'd overplayed our hand. The silence after that was the kind that had weight and edges. Cord said quietly, "So he wins." "No," Emily said. She said it before she'd fully built the structure of why, which was unusual for her, and she recognized that the certainty came from somewhere below strategy, some bedrock place that Vance had not managed to reach in 8 months of trying. He doesn't win, but we have to move differently. She looked at James. The study. I need the territorial code index and 2 hours. He was off his horse in a single motion. You've got them, he said. Mrs. Ames had supper on the table by the time Emily came out of the study, but Emily didn't go to the table. She went to the kitchen doorway and stood there with 3 pages of handwritten notes and the look on her face that Mrs. Ames had come to recognize over the past 3 weeks as the look that meant something had been broken open and rebuilt. Eat, Mrs. Ames said without looking up from the stove. In a minute, Emily said. Where is Garrett? Guest room, Mrs. Ames said. James told Pete to put him there when he rode back with you. A pause. Is he a problem? He's about to be a solution, Emily said. Or he's about to leave Millbrook on his own, which is also an option. She turned back toward the hallway. 10 minutes. 5, Mrs. Ames said. Food's hot now, cold in 10. Emily was already at the guest room door. She knocked twice. Garrett opened it. He looked like a man who had been sitting with something heavy since Creston, which he had been because she'd seen the way his face had changed on the ride back when James had told him about the letter. He'd gone quiet in a particular way, not the quiet of innocence, but the quiet of someone who has been carrying a fact they should have disclosed, and has just lost the option of disclosing it on their own terms. New Mexico, Emily said. Yes, Garrett said. How long ago? 11 years. Was it land fraud specifically or financial fraud generally? Garrett's jaw worked. Land fraud, he said. Small claim. I was 28 and I made a bad decision for fast money and I served 14 months. He met her eyes. I should have told you. Yes, she said. "You should have. Why didn't you?" "Because I thought it wouldn't matter," he said. "Because I thought what I knew about Vance was so much bigger than one old conviction that it would outweigh it." He paused. "And because I was ashamed." Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the difference between a man who hides a thing because he means to use the hiding against you, and a man who hides a thing because he can't stand the shape of it in the light. She'd known both kinds. This was the second kind. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She came in and stood at the window with her 3 pages of notes, and she looked at them and then at him. "The character exclusion statute bars your testimony in the main proceeding," she said. "But there is a separate mechanism. A territorial fraud investigation. Not a land proceeding. A criminal fraud investigation, under the marshal's authority, doesn't carry the same exclusion rules. Criminal proceeding, different evidentiary standard." She paused. "Your testimony about the Meridian Trust Incorporation, about the mechanism of the filing scheme, about what Vance told you directly, that goes to the marshal's office as a criminal complaint, separate from the commissioner's land proceeding." Garrett stared at her. "That's 2 separate cases." "Vance prepared for one," Emily said. "He didn't prepare for 2. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "He'll come after me harder if I file a criminal complaint." "Yes," she said. "He will." "He's already sent men." "I know," she said. "Which is why your safety is part of the negotiation." She held his gaze. "If you file the criminal complaint through the marshal's office, you're a protected witness under territorial criminal law. That's a different level of protection than what you have right now, which is James Caldwell's goodwill and a guest room." Garrett looked at his hands. Emily watched him work through it, the calculation, the fear, the same arithmetic she'd been doing for 8 months, weighing what you had against what you stood to lose. She understood it exactly. She didn't rush it. "What do I do?" he said finally. "Specifically, what do I do?" "You write a sworn statement," she said. "Tonight. Everything you told the commissioner, and more, every conversation you had with Vance directly, every instruction, every amount. I'll write it with you. We send it to the territorial marshal's office by rider tomorrow morning." She paused. "And then you stay inside Caldwell Range until the marshal acts on it." Garrett nodded slowly. "And Vance?" "Vance gets to find out that paperwork works both ways," Emily said. They rode until past midnight again. James brought the lamp from the study and set it on the guest room table, and stayed not because he needed to manage the process, but because Garrett's hands were shaking badly enough that he'd knocked the inkwell twice, and James steadied it both times without comment. And that steadiness in the room was doing something useful that Emily recognized but didn't interrupt. At some point, Lila appeared in the doorway with coffee and retreated without a word, which was the least Lila-like behavior Emily had observed from her, and which meant the entire ranch understood what was happening in this room tonight. The statement ran to 19 pages. It named Vance 7 times. Harpa 4, the clerk. Fellows twice the bought judge once with specific dates and amounts. And it described the Meridian Trust mechanism in enough detail that a territorial marshal's investigator could dismantle it without needing any other source. Garrett signed it. His hand steadied for the signature, which Emily thought said something about the particular relief of finally putting your name on a true thing. James witnessed it. Emily witnessed it. She wrote the covering letter to the marshal's office in 15 minutes, addressed to Chief Marshal Donahue in the territorial capital, and referenced Commissioner Webb's proceeding by case number, so the 2 actions would be linked in the record from day 1. She folded it, sealed it, set it on the table. "Cord rides at first light," James said. "Cord's going to spend a lot of his life riding to government offices," Cord said from the hallway, where he had apparently been standing for some indeterminate period of time. "I'll raise your wages," James said. "Already planning on it," Cord said, and his boots moved away down the hall. Garrett looked at the sealed letter, then at Emily. "Is this going to work?" "Yes," she said. She said it the same way she'd said Vance doesn't win in the yard from the bedrock place, not the strategy place. It's going to work because it's true. True things properly documented and properly submitted work. It's the only thing in my experience that consistently does. Garrett was quiet. Then, I'm sorry. About the accounts. About all of it. I know, she said. Pay it back with interest and do straight work from here forward. That's all the sorry that means anything. He nodded. She picked up the lamp and left him the candle and walked out into the hallway where James was waiting. He took the lamp from her automatically. They walked back toward the main house side by side, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the night was deep and full around Millbrook, and the stars were doing their extravagant mountain thing overhead, and everything was very still. You found the second mechanism in 2 hours, James said. It took me 1 hour and 40 minutes, she said. I spent 20 minutes ruling out 3 approaches that didn't work. Emily. What? I'm trying to tell you something. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. He was holding the lamp between them, and in its light, his face was very clear, tired, steady, entirely present. I know you can solve every problem that comes through that gate, he said. I've watched you do it for 3 weeks. I'm not surprised anymore. What I'm trying to say is that it's not the solving that... He stopped, started over. When I rode back into that yard today and saw Pete at the gate, and I thought for 1 second that something had happened while we were gone, that you were... He stopped again. She waited. I don't want to manage from a distance what matters to me most, he said. That's all. That's the whole thing. The lamp burned between them in the dark of Millbrook, and Emily Hart looked at James Caldwell and understood that this was one of those moments that divides a life not dramatically, not with noise, but with the quiet absolute finality of a door closing on one room and opening on another. Ask me, she said. You said you'd ask me after the Rafter Tea survey. Ask me now instead. He looked at her. Stay, he said. Not because there's work, not because it's practical. Stay because this is where you belong and we both know it. We've known each other 3 weeks, she said. I know, he said. Ask me if I'm sure anyway. She looked at him. He looked back. His expression was what it always was at its most unguarded. No performance. No pressure, just the plain, honest face of a man offering a plain, honest thing. Are you sure? She said. Yes, he said. No pause. No qualification. Emily breathed in the night air of Millbrook pine resin dry grass, the faint smell of wood smoke from the house, and she thought about Harrow's notch, and $11, and cracked boots. And she thought about 12 pages at midnight, and 7 void filings, and a territorial commissioner who had written her name down twice. And she thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere and find that the arriving was not the end of something, but the beginning of it. The Rafter Tea resurvey response is going to come in the next week, she said. Probably, he said. And the marshal's office will need follow-up correspondence when they acknowledge the complaint. Most likely. And the boundary survey reclassification is 6 weeks minimum. I wasn't exaggerating about that. I know, he said. I wasn't asking you to stop working. I know you weren't, she said. And then, yes. He stilled. Yes, she said again. I'll stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have somewhere to go now. I built that in Creston. I could build it anywhere. I'm staying because I want to. Because this ground is worth standing on, and the work is worth doing, and you... She paused. Let the true thing take its full shape before she said it. You are the first person in a very long time who looked at what I could do and made room for it, instead of trying to make it smaller. James was very still. The lamp in his hand held steady. That's everything, he said quietly. Yes, she said. It is. He reached out, and she understood a beat before it happened what he was going to do. Not a gesture of possession or claim, but the simplest possible thing a hand extended offered. Take it or don't. She took it. His hand was calloused and warm, and held hers with the same quality as everything else about him, firm without force, present without pressure. They stood like that for a moment in the dark yard of Millbrook Station, under a mountain sky that was doing its enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing. And neither of them needed to say anything else, because the thing had been said, and it was true. And true things properly stated don't need footnotes. Gag. The marshal's office acknowledged the complaint in 8 days. On the 9th day, Deacon Hart was removed from his county position pending investigation. On the 11th day, the clerk named Fellows was arrested at the county land office while attempting to amend 3 of the Meridian Trust filings, an action that the responding deputy marshal described in his report as the least subtle thing he had witnessed in 11 years of service. On the 14th day, Commissioner Webb issued formal void findings on all 7 fraudulent land filings and registered the clean boundary claims for Caldwell Range at the territorial level. Emily read each piece of correspondence aloud at the supper table the evening it arrived. The whole table heard it: James, Pete Cord, Mrs. Ames, Lila Duff, and Garrett, who was still in the guest room and working off the $40 at supply rate, as agreed. Each reading was met with a particular Millbrook silence, not celebration. Exactly more. The sound of people who have been holding tension for a long time, feeling it, release notch by notch. On the 15th day, a letter arrived from the territorial capital addressed to Miss Emily Hart Caldwell, Range Millbrook Station, from Chief Marshal Donahue's office. It thanked her for the thoroughness of the criminal complaint documentation, noted that the Vance investigation was now active at the territorial level, and informed her that her name had been forwarded to the Territorial Attorney General's office as a resource in future land fraud proceedings should she be willing to consult. She read that one privately in the study at the desk that was now hers. She sat with it for a while. Then she folded it, put it in the second drawer, and went back to the Rafter Tea correspondence, which had come in 2 days prior, and which was, as she had predicted, pushing back on the resurvey cost split, with exactly the 3 objections she had anticipated. She had responses for all 3. She'd had them before the objections arrived. She was on the second response when James came into the study. He looked at the Rafter Tea papers spread across the desk. He looked at her. He looked at the second drawer, which she had left slightly open, and he looked at her again with a question in his face. "Marshal's office," she said. "They want me to consult on future cases." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to—" She considered it. She thought about Commissioner Webb writing her name down twice. She thought about the second brief addressed to Judge Harlan Moss that she'd written in 20 minutes at midnight because she didn't like being unprepared. She thought about what it would mean to take that skill and put it to use beyond the boundaries of Caldwell Range, to be the person who could read the law and use it in places where people were being papered out of their land and their lives. "Yes," she said. "When I can do it from here. Correspondence work, documentation review." She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. Once. The nod that meant understood settled good. He pulled the chair that sat at the corner of the desk, the one she'd started leaving there for him without meaning to, and that he'd started using without commenting on, and he sat down and picked up the Rafter Tea letter and read it. "They're arguing the survey boundary from the 1871 Creek record," he said. "I know," she said. Second response addresses it. "The 1871 survey was conducted by a man named Albright, who lost his certification the following year. His surveys carry diminished weight under territorial evidence rules." James set the letter down. "You knew that before they made the argument." "I knew they'd make the argument," she said. "The 1871 record is the only thing they have." So I looked up Albright. He looked at her with the expression she now knew by its exact shape. The open door, the full quiet version of the thing that had been building since a dusty road in Harrow's Notch, when he'd seen her cracked boots and told her she'd die if she waited for mercy. She knew it now. She knew it the way you know a thing that has become part of the structure of your days, load-bearing and unannounced. "You are something Emily Hart," he said. "I'm a bookkeeper," she said. "You are considerably more than that," he said. "Well," she said, "the books are still where I started." She picked up her pen. "And they still need keeping." He stayed at the corner of the desk while she worked. He had his own papers, range management notes, Cattle counts the ongoing record of a working operation that never stopped needing attention. They worked in the same silence they'd been working in since the first 7 o'clock morning meeting, the silence that was not empty, but full, that was not avoidance, but the particular comfort of two people who had found that being in the same room doing their own work was one of the better things the world offered. Outside, Millbrook moved through its afternoon. Pete crossing the yard, Cord's voice at the barn, Mrs. Ames's kitchen producing the smell of something that would be good at 6 o'clock. Ordinary sounds, working sounds. Then Pete's voice changed. Emily heard it before she understood it, a sharp carrying note that wasn't his usual easy tone. She was up from the desk before she'd made the decision, and James was right beside her, and they came out of the study door into the hallway and through the front of the house into the yard in 10 seconds. Pete was at the gate. He was not alone. There were two men on horseback that Emily didn't recognize, and between them, on a horse he clearly hadn't chosen to ride in on, was a man she recognized immediately and completely. The way you recognize something that has been a source of dread for so long, it has taken up permanent residence in your chest. Arthur Vance was 60 years old, heavier than she remembered, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had not accepted the loss of it gracefully. He was wearing a city suit that had no business on a mountain road. And he was looking at Emily with the expression of a man who has run out of legal options and has decided to try the direct approach. He hadn't come with an army. He'd come with two men and his own presence, which told her something important. He was calculating that presence was enough, that she would see him, and something would collapse in her, the 8 months of running, the accumulated exhaustion, the simple animal response to the face of the person who had caused you the most harm. She walked to the gate. James was beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. "Mr. Vance," she said. "Emily," he said. He made her name sound like a claim. He'd always done that. "I think we should talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said. "The Territorial Marshal has an active investigation into your land fraud operation. The Meridian Trust filings have been voided. The county land office clerk is under arrest. Whatever you were trying to accomplish on Caldwell Range is finished." She paused. "And the deed instrument you used against my father's estate has been filed as exhibit evidence in the criminal complaint. A territorial attorney is currently reviewing whether the interest calculation constitutes fraud in itself." Vance's face did not change the way people's faces changed in stories. He didn't go pale or show fear. He was too old and too practiced for visible fear. But something moved behind his eyes, something recalculating something that had expected a different version of this conversation. He'd come expecting a frightened woman. He'd found something he hadn't prepared for. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have." He looked at James. "Caldwell, you've let a woman drag your ranch into a territorial investigation." "She didn't drag me anywhere," James said. His voice was what it always was. Flat final, not a syllable wasted. "She showed me what was happening on my own land, and we dealt with it together." He paused. "You came here to intimidate her. I'd like you to notice that it isn't working." Vance looked at Emily again. She held his gaze, and she did not look away, and she did not feel the thing he was waiting for her to feel, the thing he'd built his entire operation around, the particular collapse that happened when someone who had been reduced long enough finally saw the face of the person who had reduced them. She didn't feel it. She felt clear. She felt the ground under her feet and the man beside her, and 12 pages at midnight and 19 pages after that, and the second drawer with the marshal's letter in it. She felt like herself, fully, entirely, without apology. "Leave Caldwell Range," she said. "If you return, the marshal's office will be notified of the visit, and it will be added to the criminal file as evidence of witness intimidation. That carries its own penalties under territorial law." She paused. "I know the statute. Don't make me use it." Vance looked at her for a long, assessing moment. Then at James. Then at Cord, who had appeared at the barn door with his arms crossed, and the quiet, absolute patience of a man who has ridden 4 days to a territorial commissioner and would ride 4 more without complaint if the situation required it. Then at Pete, who was standing at the gate with his hat in his hands again, But this time it wasn't worry. It was the hat and hands of a man who is very carefully not doing something with his hands that he would prefer to be doing. Vance turned his horse around. His 2 men turned with him. He rode toward the gate, and Pete stepped back to let him through, and as he passed Emily, he looked down at her one last time. She looked back. She did not look away until he was through the gate, and the gate was between them. Then she breathed. James's hand found her shoulder, not grabbing, not gripping, just present, the same quality as everything he offered, steady, deliberate there. She put her hand over his for a moment. Just a moment. Then she dropped it, and she turned back to the house because there was a Rafter T response on her desk that needed finishing, and the marshal's office consultation letter that needed a reply, and 6 weeks of boundary survey, reclassification correspondence that was not going to write itself. She walked back into the house. James walked with her. "He's not done," she said when they were in the hallway. "No," James said, "but he's close. The criminal investigation will take months. I know. I'll need to stay current on every development. Respond to the attorney's inquiries, update the documentation as new evidence comes in." "I know," he said. She stopped at the study door. She looked at him. He looked at her. His hand was still warm from her shoulder, and the afternoon was settling into the particular late-hour quiet of a working ranch winding down, and the corner chair was at the desk, and the lamp was lit, and the Rafter T response was on the second page waiting. "This is going to take a while," she said. "Emily," he said with the quiet certainty of a man who has made his decision and made it from something deep and solid and entirely unmovable. "I'm not going anywhere either." She walked into the study. She sat at the desk. She picked up her pen. He sat in the corner chair and picked up his papers, and outside Millbrook Station, breathed in the long mountain evening, and inside the study, a lamp burned over 2 people doing the work they were built for side by side on ground they had both chosen and had earned. Emily Hart had come to the edge of everything she knew with $11 and cracked boots and a letter of introduction, and she had built something from it, not because someone gave it to her, but because she had known her own worth when no one else was willing to name it. And she had held on to that knowledge through 8 months of running until she found the ground solid enough to stop. She pressed her pen to the paper. She wrote the Rafter T response in her clean, clear hand, and it was correct, and it was thorough, and it was hers. That was enough. That was everything. And that was where she stayed.